Have you ever had the thought, I think something needs to change? Job, relationship, maybe it's your living room. I don't know. Maybe it's where you live, something very big, or maybe it's simply just the way that you're living your days. But then another thought comes in and it says, well, what if I make the wrong choice? Or what if I live to regret it? And what if what is on the other side is not as good as what I have now? Oof, that's a hard one. Because I think this is actually one of the most common human experiences that we face when we're thinking about a change. And we often imagine that a choice is something between something that is bad and something that is good. But actually, what happens is that real change is actually much more complicated than this. So oftentimes we're choosing through between things that we value. So it could be like this familiar life that we've built, or the unknown life that we might create, or the identity that we knew or that we have now versus the person that we might become. Or maybe it's the things that we love and the things that we sense we have actually outgrown. And that's why change feels so difficult for so many people. And meaningful change, in order for it to last, it almost always comes with some type of loss. And that's really hard to deal with, even if it's the right kind of change. I'm Heather Grzych. I'm an author and an Ayurvedic practitioner, and I'm the host of the Wisdom of the Body podcast. And I'm so happy that you're here today because together we are helping people rewrite narratives. And today we are going to explore one of the hardest questions that we ask ourselves, which is, how do you know when it's time to change your life? And I think many of us have absorbed this idea that if something is truly right, it should feel good. It should feel easy, right? But I think, you know, we think if we're making this correct decision that we should feel certain. But personally, I've not seen that be how transformation works. Sometimes the thing that helps us grow is actually the thing that we most want to avoid. And sometimes the truth that we need to hear is the truth that actually irritates us. And sometimes that conversation that we don't want to have is actually the conversation that opens a door to something that's going to be amazing. Now, this doesn't mean that every uncomfortable feeling that we experience is a sign. I'm not meaning to read into it that way. And it doesn't mean that every criticism that we receive is true. And it doesn't mean that we should abandon our own wisdom and think that every opinion that we hear from everybody else is what we should be listening to. But I do think there's something worth paying attention to. When something repeatedly creates a strong reaction inside us, it may actually be worth asking, well, why does this keep coming up? And why does this actually create a very strong reaction for me? Why does this bother me? Why do I want to immediately reject it? Why does it feel threatening? Because sometimes these reactions are protecting something very precious, and we have to get at that very precious thing. And sometimes they're protecting something that we've actually already outgrown. And one of my favorite stories from the Christian tradition comes from the New Testament. So the story of Peter, if you're familiar with, Jesus had all these apostles, and Peter was one of Jesus's closest apostles. So the story goes, he was very passionate, he was outspoken, and he was the kind of person that believed he knew exactly who he was. He saw himself as loyal and brave, and he would stand beside the people that he loved no matter what happened. And actually what happened was, before Jesus got arrested, that led to him being crucified and all that, Peter actually declared very confidently that he would never, ever, even if everyone else abandoned Jesus, he would never abandon him. He would just be like his most loyal follower. He really believed this about himself. And then hours later, everything changed because Jesus got arrested. People started recognizing Peter. And then they asked him, are you one of his followers? And 3 different times, Peter denied it. The person who was saying, like, I will never, I will always be by your side. And then Peter remembered at some point that Jesus said this would happen. So according to the story, he went away and he wept. And it was shocking, right? That the way that he saw himself was not actually what happened when it came down to it. I've always wondered what that moment felt like for Peter. Not just because he failed somebody that he loved, but because he discovered something about himself that he never expected. The person that he thought he was not the person that he became under pressure. And I think many of us know that feeling, maybe not in the same circumstances, but we've had moments in life when it reveals something about ourselves that we wish were not true or that we weren't ready to see about ourselves. Maybe we realize that we're more afraid than we thought, or we may be realizing that we've been avoiding something or hiding something, or maybe it's that the life that we've built is no longer reflecting who we are. And that can be very painful because before we can change, we often have to see clearly. That's what makes this kind of change stick. One of the hardest parts of growth is that the truth is rarely, rarely comfortable. And we want transformation to feel inspiring. We want this big breakthrough moment. We want clarity. We want certainty. We want all these amazing, energizing things. But sometimes the transformation begins with something much less glamorous, like an uncomfortable realization or a conversation that we didn't want to have or a pattern that we don't want to admit. And I think this is where curiosity becomes important, because if something rubs you the wrong way, you don't have to immediately accept it as true, but you might ask, like, well, why did that affect me so strongly? Because sometimes that discomfort is a signal, not always that something is wrong, sometimes that something is just important. And you got to figure that out. Now, I love stories from whether it's Christian traditions or other spiritual and religious traditions, like I shared earlier. This next story comes from the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. So there's a story that's been told for thousands of years from Greek mythology. It's about the story of Persephone. So Persephone, at the beginning of the story, she's a young woman. She's living with her mother and they live joyously. They're in the crops in the fields, and Persephone's often off, she's a young woman. So she's often, while her mother is tending to the fields, she's often carrying bouquets of flowers and collecting flowers. She's really young and beautiful. And Demeter is her mother, and she's the goddess of agriculture and the harvest, hence why they're in the field. And their relationship is really this world that's familiar to both of them. And Persephone, being the daughter, she knows who she is. She's the daughter and she belongs somewhere and she understands that place there. But then Persephone is actually taken into the underworld by Hades. And that's kind of scary, isn't it? But she's taken into the underworld. Hades is the god of the underworld. And Persephone has this loss because she been taken from her home, but also her mother's grief is like insane because her mother just starts searching for her. And Demeter's grief is so profound that the earth itself becomes barren and the crops stop growing and the world enters winter. And eventually a compromise is reached where Hades agrees to release Persephone up to the world above, but only half of the year. So this is where the idea of seasons and there being time of growth and a time of dormancy each year, according to the seasons and the seasons of light and temperature and all of that, that is such a big deal with farming in the natural world. So she doesn't return permanently. She returns half the year. She's in the underworld, and half the year she gets to come back up to the above world. And what's always fascinated me about this story is that when she returns, she's not the person who she was when she left. She's not this like person that just goes around and collects the bouquet of flowers as this daughter. No, now she's actually the queen of the underworld. She's the queen of the underworld. She's gained something. She's lost something too. She still loves her mother. She remembers her old life, but she can't go back and become exactly who she was before. No, that's gone. And I think that's one of the deepest truths about change is that we often think the goal is to get back to who we were. And sometimes life changes us in ways that make going backward impossible. You might have a major loss or a new responsibility. Maybe a relationship ends. You become a parent. Maybe you lose a parent. You might change careers. or move somewhere new. These are huge things. They don't erase the person that you were, but they add something, and they create a person who's lived through something. And that changes a person. It makes us different than we were before. And I think that's why change is so complicated, because we aren't only afraid of losing the things that we dislike, we're afraid of losing the things that we love. So if you change your career, you might be afraid that you're going to lose your identity that you've built previously. Or if you leave one relationship, you might grieve a future that you imagined that wasn't there. Or maybe if you change your life, you might miss parts of your old life, even if you know that the change was necessary, because we want the new thing, but we don't want to lose the old thing. And sometimes that isn't possible. Sometimes we have to lose the old thing. Sometimes becoming actually requires releasing something. And this is one of the reasons I love plants, because when you observe them, you see that a plant doesn't look over at the next plant and think to itself, I'm never going to let my leaves turn brown like that. No, because the leaves change because of the conditions, the amount of sunlight, the amount of nutrients in the soil, the quality of the soil, the water that it's getting, the temperature, the season, the environment. It's not shaming itself for responding to reality. It adapts, it changes, right? It moves towards the sun. It lets go of leaves. It lets go of things. And when the conditions are right, it grows again. And one plant doesn't look at this other plant that's flowering and think, why am I not blooming yet? No, because plants understand something that we forget, which is that growth happens in seasons. And some seasons are for flowering, and some seasons are for putting down roots, and some seasons are actually for conserving energy. Some seasons are for letting go. And another thing I love about plants is that they don't grow every part of themselves at once, right? We've talked about this before. The roots have to deepen, the stem becomes stronger, then you get the leaves, and you get the flowers, and you get the fruit, and each stage makes the next one possible. So you might be in a certain season where a part of you is growing right now. Yeah. And maybe the growth that's happening isn't visible yet. Maybe it feels like standing still is actually a preparation that you're going through for something else. But here's actually where we're different than plants. Plants respond to their environment. Cool, we do too. We can respond, but there's an additional thing that we do more than plants. Plants maybe do this to a very small degree, but we do this because we have imagination, we have awareness, and we have agency. We actually reshape our environments. So because we have these things, we have will, we have agency, imagination, we can notice the conditions that are influencing us. And we can actually ask, like, well, are these conditions that I want to keep living in? We can choose what we expose ourselves to. We could choose the books that we read, the conversations that we have, and the people that we spend our time with. Maybe we even choose the work that we devote ourselves to, or the food that we eat, or the habits that we practice. All of these things give us agency. They reshape us, and they reshape the world around us. Even the words and ideas that we allow to take root in our minds, they shape us. And perhaps most remarkably, we can imagine a future that does not exist yet. We can imagine that future, and we can begin to make choices today that help bring that future into being, because our circumstances, they actually influence us, but they don't completely define us. And this is one of the most extraordinary gifts of being human. And it's one of the reasons I love Ayurveda, which I've studied and practice and do with my clients, because Ayurveda begins with observation. Ayurveda means the science of life. So before we try to change something, we learn to see it clearly. That's essential. What are the conditions? What are the patterns that keep repeating? What gives me energy? What drains it? And what happens if I create more structure? What happens if I spend less time here or more time here? What happens if I change what I consume, change who I'm around, not just in my diet, but through my eyes and through my other senses? Because our bodies are constantly communicating. And the outside world is constantly communicating with us, and our bodies are responding, and we have to listen to them. Sometimes we're searching for a very dramatic answer when our body has actually been quietly telling us something for years. And so Ayurveda teaches that by understanding the conditions of our lives, we actually gain the opportunity to change them. And it's very powerful. Sometimes we need to change our routines. Sometimes it's our environment. Sometimes it's our relationship. Sometimes it's as simple as just changing a food that we eat. Sometimes it's perspective that needs to change. Sometimes it's all of the above. If you change one thing, all these other things change as well. The point isn't to force ourselves into becoming something else. It's to create the conditions where the person we're capable of becoming has room to grow. Thanks for being here today, and I'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. Visit heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.